September 14th, and rockets are flying toward the Crimean Bridge.
This is fucked, gentlemen, I have to say. Absolutely unbelievable. I really mean it.
The bridge has been blown up. The bridge has been blown up. Ooh, ooh, ooh. A new special operation by the SBU. Strikes on the bridge, the Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea's air defense. And something terrible has begun in Crimea. A new series of explosions on the peninsula. Tarkanka, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisaray district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Now, out of 12 missiles that were flying towards the bridges, right now, as you can see, this is exactly it, the Chonhar Bridge.
The security service of Ukraine is starting a new phase of special operations. They are attacking the Crimean Bridge, military facilities, airfields, and military bases. Panic and evacuation have begun in Crimea.
We've been standing here since 4 a.m. for 25 minutes, around 5 o'clock, and here already at 6. They turned us around and sent everyone home to rest.
We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Seveni. Right now.
There it goes, an oil depot.
So a recent sequence of explosions has occurred in Crimea. God, SBU, please do not stop. No. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisaray district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has started in Crimea. Evacuation in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad: the headquarters of the Northern Fleet, the nuclear submarines in Severomorsk, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge is damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, for example, the strikes on a Russian strategic aviation aircraft, these are strategic targets, and moreover, there are 5 of them, as it turned out, 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the Ukrainian one, but it was hit. At least one already confirmed, 295 at Ukrainka. So, strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge is real. It has strategic significance because it connects Taman, it connects Russian territory with our peninsula, Crimea. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed basically until we liberate Crimea, or let's say until bombers can approach and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on it. This bridge cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do so. The only way is through engineering methods to destroy it, meaning blowing up all the pillars, so you have to bring it down, but there will be a lot of problems with that at the very least. Not just deactivating it from an active state, but for example, simply damaging it as it was damaged at one time. Security services, both in 2022 and 2023, managed to disable it for a certain period, at least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign. This is truly significant. Moreover, the strike specifically on the Kerch Bridge is tied to the start of our liberation campaign for the deoccupation of the Crimean Peninsula. Why? Because without a doubt, the bridge must first be destroyed or damaged or put out of commission. There are different ways to do this. It needs to be disabled so that the Russians cannot transfer enough troops to Crimea. After that, with long-range strike capabilities, using the same drones and missiles to Crimea, which is 200 to 300 kilometers away. We have the capability, almost everything we have can fly that far. That is the main range for our strike assets, long-range operational level weapons, which are also handled by the security service. Therefore, I think the next wave will be strikes specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are more than 100. At a minimum, there are currently stationary sites in operation and about 100 mobile ones as well. The work of the special services, there is still a vast amount of so-called work ahead, but this much can already be said. The strike on the Kerch Bridge is the beginning of this liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Legok, regarding the nuclear triad, I heard Keith Kellogg's comment. He is simply stunned. He believes this is a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. Ukraine struck at two components of the Russian Federation's nuclear triad. This concerns the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And do you feel that the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU's special operation?
Well, then there will be a third phase as well. If, for example, a Russian submarine gets hit, I wouldn't be surprised. In the same Northern Fleet, in the same Pacific Fleet, because they feel too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both the Russians' ground positions and their strategic positions. Only the naval component remains. And so in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather, if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet and then went silent somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that another Russian submarine might be sunk. Putin, as always, will say. What happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the Astrakhan aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? It broke up into quarks. So this could also happen. Let's wait and see. Ahead, there is probably still a third serious blow to come. And this is the first one. You were right to pay attention to the triad. Emphasize this point properly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main ones. It was the first component to be armed, specifically strategic bombers, which are Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. The Maluk strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world, definitely. Why? Because, well, a $500 drone or a sufficient number of drones that can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. It's possible, and everyone understands perfectly well, that now the era of drones has begun. The era of drones gives the impression that very soon planet Earth will turn into something like that. Planet Shelesiak. There is no water, no vegetation, no minerals, and it is inhabited by robots. That is, it is populated by such drones, and in the end, the apocalypse. It may, of course, eventually come true, which, as we have seen before, was once vividly shown in various Hollywood films. That is to say, Hollywood. This problem really exists in all countries of the world that have invested in strategic security mechanisms. Well, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over 100 years? In the end, a $500 drone can just take it out in 1, 2, 3, as demonstrated by Malyuk. That's why I would say that Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the cornerstone at the beginning of a new era in security provision. Other mechanisms, the real investment should be in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, drones. Drones that can perform tasks for very little. With minimal funding, they can accomplish major objectives. Basically, all these strategies will eventually be destroyed. At one time, if anyone remembers, Reagan, I think it was him, may he rest in peace, once said something. He had a great monologue. There was one where he talked about those 6-story fools, the dinosaurs. Where are they now? Extinct. But the little bug, it's been around for 3 billion, or was it 30 billion years, and it still thrives. That's more or less what it's like now. The next era will be something along those lines. So those little bugs we're talking about now, the small drones, they'll keep getting smaller, but without losing their combat effectiveness. And eventually, what will they reach? They'll reach what Putin recently predicted, together with Skabiva and all that Russian media riffraff. Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about combat mosquitoes. But believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes swarm into Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, up to the Urals, I won't even say anything. There won't be a single Russian left there. They'll be moving westward. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, not a single one. Filters don't help. You have to wear gas masks if you're anywhere near Russia or a Russian Federation citizen. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd. All this Russian Federation herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation at all? Yes?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and basically we've already carried out missions there. Olenish is not far from the base. Yes, so this direction is basically possible, even with long-range strike systems launched from our side. But as for Vladivostok, in some ways, that's even easier. We've actually discussed ourselves what Vladivostok is like. Well, that's the Green Klin. That's the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians have been there genetically for over 100 years. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka? Well, that's just an example I know from the airfields. Chernihivka and also Ukrainka, these are our Poltava roots. The residents of Chernihiv region, naturally, and their roots, they make themselves known. And Vladivostok is truly one of the most important and beautiful jewels of this very green Klin. Our Ukrainian Vladivostok, of course, getting there is another matter. That's a minor problem. Moreover, if in the end the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic is recognized, it could even make agreements, let's say treaties. For example, with Japan regarding the return of those so-called disputed islands. Disputed, but they're Japanese islands, and even Sakhalin is Japanese. So this is exactly the issue that needs to be resolved there. At the same time, of course, putting pressure on this Pacific Fleet because there are Ukrainians in the Navy as well. Do you think that among our warrant officers there, every other one is definitely Ukrainian? That's just how our solid genetic tree is when it comes to warrant officers. Because back in the day in the Soviet army, all the sergeants were Ukrainians and all the warrant officers in the Navy were also Ukrainians. So believe me, if the survival of our nation is at stake, this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink almost the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans correctly, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Lenin, you too? When we spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars also a realistic target for Ukrainian special services naturally?
Well, that's a bit complicated. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic troops, missile troops, which means there's a certain selection process. For service, there are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there's very strict control over this component, and it's very difficult. For example, it would be quite difficult to get close and somehow destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. After all, they're all thumbs. They'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent, truly excellent missile. It was first launched, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. Later, the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. The main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions, of course, were still set in the Soviet Union. They had a strong missile engineering school there, especially. After our Ukrainian practically put everything into the missile program, if you remember. That is, while serving as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev accomplished this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the missile field, of course, was very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up on certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed and the components of the overall production cycle ended up split among different republics, most of the main ones, by the way, were with us, specifically in Ukraine. For example, the SS-18, the Satan missile, we were the ones who built it at Yuzmash. Naturally, the Topol is a successor to this kind of missile program. The Topol-M in particular is quite a good missile. The second one after it is, well, not exactly a clone, but a very similar missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. That's the Yars. First the Topol-M, then the Yars RS-24, then the RS-26. They built them all. They tried to build the Oreshnik, the so-called Rubezh. That's the Rubezh. Putin called it the Oreshnik. And the next line, the fourth missile there, is the RS-28. That's the Sarmat. But the Sarmat can't even get its rear end out of the launch silos. Out of 7 launches, there were 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. So most likely this whole series of missiles is finished. In other words, they won't really have the Sarmat. They'll fuss over Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once its media hype dies down, they'll probably forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world. Those are the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Topol has nuclear warheads and the Yars has multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. Each of them has self-guided warheads, about 6 blocks that are deployed. So this really is a serious problem, though maybe it's not as much of a problem for us since these are nuclear weapons. The Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And to fire a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at yourself is like using a microscope to hammer a lake, because this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals, for the Chinese as well. These are long-range mechanisms of destruction. For us, the main problem is different. It's the Iskanders, the KN-23, and the Kinzhal missiles, aeroballistic missiles that need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize and counter these missiles is, of course, to destroy Russia's hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on it in some way. It runs on diesel, on gasoline, it flies on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon industry needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon industry. So that's where the problem lies. It's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have launched serious production of these missiles by now, but they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that eventually we'll get them, our ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders. So first of all, it's about destroying the hydrocarbon industry. We need to target all Russian refineries, all of them. It's connected to fuel production. And secondly, of course, air defense, meaning we need to increase the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot and SMT. There is no third option.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation. Then they blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine, and essentially they supply the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation now? Last night there were explosions, and during the day the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
They packed Crimea like sardines in a can, with several million Russians from beyond the Urals who were promised something great there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian cattle in Crimea. Naturally, they also crammed military facilities in there for almost 11, well, it's the 12th year now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed them to do that. Well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end, they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing its loss back in 2014. So a large number of Russian civilian invaders, yes, they are indeed civilian invaders, as we must emphasize. None of the, well, they don't even know this crucial fact, but no protections, absolutely no protections apply to them under any circumstances. Any Russian citizen who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that apply to civilians apply to them. That is naturally for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, especially in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is a closed area, squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is in practical terms essentially a ready-made geographic operational cauldron, with only two main entry and exit points, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through the land corridors that connect it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it's towards Melitopol. You're right, through Henichesk. So those are the routes. That's why it's important for us when liberating Ukraine to start by liberating Crimea, because it's much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare, for example, the balance of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbass, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbass. That's why Crimea is clearly just asking to be the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, the first thing, of course, is to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. There's the railway bridge, the automobile bridge, the energy bridge, the fuel bridge, and the water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the entire Kerch Bridge system, and it is absolutely necessary to destroy all of them, all 5 of these bridges in this sense. The second bridge, which is next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed, the floating docks, and of course, especially the railway ferries. The third bridge, in general terms, is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships which can be used as passenger ferries between ports. For example, from the Russian Black Sea coast to our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry with a serious tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields that can be targeted, and basically the air bridge can be cut off. And the main one, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches of both highways and railways running through there. So, of course, those can be targeted as well, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Mius, and then across the Kalmius via the bridges. Realistically, though, it's very close for us, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings, and, well, that's probably what we'll do. That's why these strikes, which happened simultaneously on both the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely on the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, you cut off the supply systems, and then you hit them with long-range strike assets, which everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones for Crimea once a week. The main thing now is to retarget specifically to this component. And the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets. They will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions, first, for several months up to a year, we need to work with drones and missiles targeting military facilities in Crimea, and only then, starting next spring, or maybe during the summer campaign of 2026, our troops will move into Crimea by land, but that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to move in there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of aviation units to provide support specifically for the ground operation. Well, of course, we'll keep harassing Crimea for a while.
All in all, the Crimean summer of 2025 promises to be a hot one.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to start remembering, as we talked about back in 23, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. That's why, whether it's freestyle, breaststroke, or doggy paddle, Russians will have to swim out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those options simply won't exist.
Run, run, racists! Get out of Crimea! Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I are continuing our discussion about the SBU's web operation. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He said that these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can hit air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can strike anywhere. In terms of sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with the hostages as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
Yes, the Americans were truly shocked, not because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is, there were certain, I think, third-party protections specifically established for strategic strike assets, which were provided by these treaties. Moreover, one of the main conditions was that these planes had to be accessible for monitoring and observation by external surveillance systems, such as satellites. So it turns out that the Russians, just like the Americans, are required to park their military aircraft in areas that are clearly visible to the opposing side. But we're not the opposing side. No one told Maliuk about this. He didn't read this script. Naturally, he just went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking out one of their assets. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen to their bases too. And their bases are exposed. No one's even bothered with them. Honestly, if the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians set out to take out American strategic assets, they could do it too. And if they get serious about it, especially the Chinese, they'll really go for it. We can see how, in this regard, the Chinese have gotten ahead of everyone else in the world. So that's their problem. They're not shocked by our so-called audacity. They're shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike capabilities like drones, even a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich. Today I read a brilliant analysis by a Ukrainian woman on Facebook, a patriot. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus or other missiles that could have allowed us to destroy this entire nuclear triad. They're simply shocked, terrified that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it exactly that way, right? That is someone who is close to military topics. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century, right? That is, no one now remembers slings or, say, boomerangs. Here, we're not talking about rockets. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears. Now, that is in the last century, when rockets appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now it's already the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed. And even the same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars is no longer necessary. Just think about how much had to be invested. Trillions of dollars. And here it turns out, with his decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, Malyuk has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to put it bluntly, looting the most powerful military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service has shown a real slap in the face to this entire strategic triad, no matter what it is, especially even the nuclear component of this strategic triad. For us, it's not frightening either, for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes, sometimes it's not even clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a serious conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radionuclide glow that typically accompanies a nuclear explosion, if in fact it is truly an explosion, tends to fade away rather quickly. And believe me, if you were to scatter spent nuclear fuel rods throughout the city of Moscow, we have discussed this scenario so many times, Lenin himself would, without a doubt, rise from the dead. He would be more alive than anyone else from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet about the nuclear topic now? Because they realize perfectly well that it wasn't for nothing that a hole was poked in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might land on Grandpa Lenin there? Maybe a third head will grow and start running around saying, "No, you're on the right path, comrades." Well, more or less wherever they're told to point.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information: that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kabilash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we've destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't a psyop, and it could be a Russian psyop, they sometimes inject this kind of event into the information flow through certain dubious channels. And then if, for example, the opposing side picks it up, they present it as something negative. Then they show this Kabilash, right? And they'll start saying that we are not exactly the right kind of people in how we approach this. That's why for now, since there is no confirmation and there really isn't any, we're holding off. Although strictly speaking, given the responsibility, well, Kabilash really should have been dismissed. Whether someone will make him step down or has already made him or will do so in the future, that will depend on the Russian security services. Because if we're talking about responsibility, it was specifically Kabilash's responsibility to ensure the safety of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then later he'll be dismissed. How could it be otherwise?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week, discuss the most pressing military topics, and rejoice for our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect. The well-known analyst Roman Tsvetan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much. As always, see you again soon this week.
Goodbye.